Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. Our today's event is going to be about decolonization of the UK's relationship with Pakistan and India. Our speaker today is Dr. Mary Hunter. She is a visiting research fellow at the Center for Strategic and Contemporary Research in Islamabad. And she's working on decolonization and UK-Pakistan relations. She has completed her doctorate at the University of St. Andrews in 2024 on Zia's Islamization of Pakistan and its impact on religious minorities. She regularly contributes articles to newspapers and think tanks, particularly on topics relating to Pakistan, minorities, and Islamophobia. It will be over to Dr. Hunter now. It will be a 1 hour long session. Dr. Hunter will decide how much time she's going to leave for the questions that you people might have to put to her. Thank you very much. Over to you, Dr. Hunter.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. I think I'll try and stick to about 30 minutes, hopefully, and then we'll leave the second half for a discussion and a Q&A. If you don't mind, I'll turn off my camera just for the purpose of the presentation, because I'm sure some of you know what the quality of internet is like here sometimes in Pakistan, so it might be more conducive to the presentation to do that.
Sure.
So Zishan hopefully is going to be controlling the presentation, so hopefully this will go smoothly. As mentioned, I'm here in Islamabad and I'm working more specifically on decolonization in UK-Pakistan cultural relations. But for the purposes of this presentation, we've included India into that equation as well. So hopefully you'll find this useful. So Zishan, if you could move on to the second slide, please.
Okay, I think, yeah.
Yeah, that's perfect. Before I explain what decolonization is, we must first understand how colonization took hold in the region. This is not a complete history of colonization, but it's intended to show the multifaceted nature of colonialism and thus how complicated the far-reaching colonial legacies are in Pakistan and India today, from the economic to the legal. One of the most important critiques that I've heard of foreign aid and development projects in Pakistan was articulated by Temriz Khan, who suggested that such projects do not always address the root causes of inequalities, which are seen as too sensitive and messy to get into. And while Khan was referring to gender equality in contemporary Pakistan, I think that this also applies to the history of UK-Pakistan relations and UK-India relations, in the sense that some of the root causes of inequality we see in both countries can be traced back to the colonial period, and the British must understand that if they truly want to help in reducing inequalities, while the responsibility for addressing these root causes shifted to Pakistani and Indian leaders post-independence, we must not separate these two relationships from their historic context. It is within this context that we understand why the British colonial administration made changes in the region that continue to shape society today. The British first arrived in the region as traders through the East India Company. However, they came to recognise, especially under Robert Clive, how economic means could also be secured using military force. Following the Battle of Plassey in 1757, company rule began as the East India Company gained control of the treasury and established alliances with local leaders. Gradually, the East India Company installed British leaders in parts of India that it occupied and established sovereignty over, which became known as presidencies. These presidencies were no longer just trading posts for the British, they became administrative units. As part of their legal governance, the British created regulations as the laws of the land, but each presidency had different laws, which would become problematic for the British when they sought to systematise their rule and establish uniformity. One of the most important figures in the colonial administration was Thomas Macaulay, who influenced both the English Education Act of 1835 and the Indian Penal Code 1860. A month prior to the English Education Act, Macaulay argued that the British should no longer fund the printing of Arabic and Sanskrit books because he believed that they were useless and fundamentally inferior to European literature and education. He also recommended the closure of some schools that taught Islamic and Hindu law, and argued that the funds should be used to establish schools where English language and education would be taught. The Governor-General accepted these demands through the English Education Act 1835. Macaulay hoped that this would create a class of so-called interpreters, describing them as, and I quote, a class of persons Indian in blood and colour, but English in tastes, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect, end quote. English was already the language of the local elites, but this started the systematic attempt to create local middlemen that the British could effectively do business with and govern the population through. Company rule would end after the First War of Independence in 1857, known as the Sepoy Mutiny amongst the British, which represented the greatest existential threat to the British presence in India up to that point. Muslim and Hindu sepoys alike united in opposition to the British, partly motivated by the expectation that they would use rifle cartridges covered in pig or cow lard, which would contravene their dietary laws respectively. But there were also wider concerns among the indigenous populations regarding British intentions over religious conversion and the suppression of indigenous languages and education. The British eventually quelled the resistance and sent the last Mughal emperor into exile for his part in facilitating it. Consequently, direct rule by the Crown replaced company rule in 1858. We can also see how this war helped to spark greater suspicion towards the indigenous population, which manifested as pseudo-scientific and social Darwinian stereotypes about the nature of Indian Muslims and Hindus that shaped colonial perceptions of these communities. Another very crucial element of colonization was the completion of the Indian Penal Code in 1860, having begun in the 1830s. The architects, of which Macaulay was one, said that the point of the Penal Code was to end the lack of consistency in criminal law across the presidencies and to bring equal justice to all people. But this was resisted by the European community in India, where there was an attempt to reform the legal system such that indigenous judges could rule over cases in which Europeans were defendants through the Ilbert Bill of 1883. Furthermore, scholars have interpreted chapters of the Penal Code, especially offences relating to religion, as aimed specifically at controlling and changing the indigenous population, given that the British colonial administration perceived the people to be religiously fanatic. The law was just another aspect of the so-called civilizing mission, which sought to educate the people. The Indian Penal Code remains in force in Pakistan and India today as one of the most significant colonial legacies that impacts everyday lives. Could you move to the next slide, please, Ishan? Decolonization is now a word that we hear frequently, certainly in the context of academia and education. But it's important that we take seriously what it means in practice and not just use it as a buzzword or a tick box exercise as something to be discussed and then forgotten. It must involve practical change. In the formal sense, decolonization from external and direct colonial rule is the process by which a people struggle for political and economic freedom. Pakistan's and India's independence from the British in August 1947 is a good example of this, though I would argue it happens more concretely with the adoption of their first constitutions. Self-governments, self-determination, and autonomy are key aspects of formal decolonization. But the end of direct colonial rule by external forces does not mean the achievement of full decolonization. Colonial legacies remained ingrained within Pakistan's and India's societies, class relations, national institutions, and educational and legal systems. Therefore, decolonization of internal colonial legacies and the ideas that underpins colonialism is a comprehensive and vast process that requires specific strategies. I have listed some examples here that are particularly relevant in terms of the UK's cultural relations with Pakistan and India. Linguistically, as mentioned, British colonialism established English as a means of social mobility, the language of the elite, and as the medium for education, business, and politics. Linguistic decolonization would thus involve replacing English with indigenous languages, such that a greater number of people beyond the middle and upper classes can have full access to education and to administrative and political jobs. In education, decolonization requires including more indigenous scholars and ideas on the syllabus, And rather than approaching education in the same way as in the West, it would allow for local approaches to knowledge production that are more relatable. Regarding the law, scholars have shown how unequal access to justice in post-colonial or neo-colonial states is in part a colonial legacy, particularly in terms of how power affects the outcome of cases, and power in turn is often connected to land ownership. Gifts of land was a means by which the British bought local loyalty. Not to mention that Pakistanis and Indians are often made subject to criminal laws that were not created by their elected officials and were designed to control and repress the independence movements of pre-partition India. Legal decolonization would require reform of the legal system in such a way that power does not determine outcomes, local wisdom and approaches shape the achievement of justice, and repressive colonial laws are removed. Finally, the colonial project relied on justifications for the so-called civilizing mission through ideas, especially the idea that Europe was inherently superior to this region in terms of culture and civilization, and that democracy, human rights, and freedom were brought from Europe. Indigenous scholars suggest that these ideas remain through Western approaches to international relations with formerly colonized nations. If you could move to the next slide, please, Deshaun. A key component of post-colonial and decolonial critique is that decolonization cannot be understood purely as a process enacted by the British government unilaterally without influence from Indigenous people, leaders, and movements. It was not only in colonization, but also in formal decolonization that the British colonial administration often congratulated itself for giving freedom to the people of Pakistan and India. But we must recognize the agency of Indigenous movements in helping to achieve liberation. Mahatma Gandhi is widely acknowledged in the UK for his role now, but the same is not the case for leaders instrumental in the wider independence movement. Such figures also influenced social movements in Britain as well, which shows how the claim that civil rights and resistance was not a Western concept brought to this region by the colonists. It should also be noted that formal decolonization was not a straightforward linear process. Each time there was a step towards independence, there was another step back. For example, during the First and Second World Wars, the British used emergency powers to suppress the independence movement and even unilaterally declared India to be involved in the Second World War without consulting its leaders. While the UK committed to the Atlantic Charter with the US in August 1941, affirming how sovereignty and self-government should be returned to those deprived of it, it would still not allow British India to have either of those things for another 6 years. Therefore, this period should not be whitewashed as evidence for British imperial benevolence. Here is a very incomplete list of important moments in formal decolonisation from direct British rule, but it highlights some of the key legislation that formally enacted the process. The Government of India Acts were intended as steps towards the realisation of self-government for the people of India. They expanded the vote to a greater number of people and increased the autonomy of the provincial legislators, such that more power was devolved. But ultimately, much of the power remains with the central executive legislature, controlled by the British Governor-General. There were also important decolonial steps through the holding of provincial and central legislative elections, because it allowed the people to determine their representatives. But again, the votes remain the privileged of the few. The Indian nationalist leaders importantly pushed back against these pieces of legislation, and the resistance by the people against the colonial administration proved to the British that their indefinite colonisation of the country was both unwelcome and unsustainable. Next slide, please, Deshaun.
Sure.
And it was only with the independence of Pakistan and India from the British Empire in August 1947 that formal decolonisation truly began, as facilitated through the Indian Independence Act 1947. This allowed the new Governor-Generals of Pakistan and India to assent to bills independent of the British, empowered their constituent assemblies to make laws, and these laws could not be declared null and void because of their incompatibility with British laws. But this did not mark full decolonisation either. Symbolically, the Act stated that the Governor-Generals would be appointed by the King and that they were his representatives. On the request of the Pakistani leaders, Brits also remained in post as provincial governors and commanders-in-chief of the armed forces to help with the transfer of power. In India, Mountbatten became the first post-independence Governor-General. Both Pakistan and India also remained dominions of the British Empire until the adoption of their first constitutions in March 1956 and November 1949, respectively. Next slide, please, Ishan. It is only with this background that we can understand what decolonisation means in the context of international relations. While I won't go into detail here, decolonisation can also occur within international relations as an academic discipline because it largely originated in the Western context and is dominated by Western scholarship and ideas. I've listed some of these decolonial processes here. But more relevant in terms of the subject of this talk is decolonisation within international relations as a practice of governments. I will go into this in more detail later, but this started to take shape immediately after the independence of Pakistan and India. These decolonial processes include reduction in reliance on the British for trade and finance, diversification of relationships, independence in foreign policy decision-making, greater parity in the UK-Pakistan and UK-India relationships, and non-interference in domestic matters. Next slide, please, Ishan. Hopefully, it has become clear from my presentation why further decolonisation of ongoing colonial legacies is important. Firstly, because of the inequalities and injustices that remain in Pakistan and India as a result of colonial practices, decolonisation provides a means of redress for the most marginalised communities in the country. Secondly, it allows us to recognise Indigenous contributions to language, arts, sciences, and very importantly, freedom and human rights. This challenges the colonial idea that all good things came from the West. Thirdly, decolonisation allows us to dismantle those racist and Eurocentric ideas that underpinned colonialism. I would argue that we have to situate problems like Islamophobia in the UK within colonial and Orientalist conceptions of Muslims, with religiously aggravated crimes against Muslims remaining the most common form of such hate crime in the UK today. Fourthly, decolonisation allows us to foster greater balance and parity in international relations, which is usually dominated by the powerful nations of the global north and sometimes at the expense of those of the global south. Fifthly, decolonisation allows for the fostering of balance and greater parity in international relations because countries are recognised for their unique place within and contribution to our world and not looked down upon as merely formerly colonised and so-called underdeveloped nations. Next slide, please, Ishan. I surveyed the statements made in the British Houses of Parliament shortly after independence in August 1947 to understand how decolonisation was continuing to take shape in the UK's relationship with Pakistan and India. One important aspect is how British politicians advocated consulting Pakistan and India on sensitive international matters. The effect on Pakistan and India was also considered in British agreements with other foreign powers, such as over the Anglo-Egyptian Agreement for a Suez Canal zone base in 1954, in terms of how the operation of the British in this area might affect the sense in these countries of the existence of a power that can come to their aid. Decolonisation also manifested through the diversification of Pakistan's and India's international relationship, which was a concern for the British. For example, in 1952, one member of the House of Lords suggested reconsidering the trading relationships within the Commonwealth in light of British dominions seeking economic connections elsewhere. He specifically mentioned a statement by Pakistan that it no longer intended to have a so-called imperial preference, i.e. a trading preference towards the UK. This concern became particularly acute in the context of the UK-Pakistan relationship with regards to competition over trade with Pakistan, as Pakistan was increasingly turning towards Japan instead. And it was also increasingly operating outside the sterling area within the dollar area. Despite some consultation, by 1955, both Pakistan and India were disappointed with the fact that the Western powers were not consulting them enough in matters that affected them, that there was increased tension between the US and China, and that colonialism continued to exist. So they helped to organise the Bandung Conference of 1955 as an act of Asian-African solidarity. Some British politicians expressed concern over what this would mean for the UK. This anti-colonial thrust grew into the non-aligned movement in 1961, the members of which would not be formally aligned with or against any one major bloc, particularly those of the Soviet bloc and American bloc during the Cold War. This was because the interests of such nations were not always best served by engagement within such conflicts. Both Pakistan and India have been criticised for their ongoing relationship with Russia since its invasion of Ukraine. But the argument that I've heard repeatedly is that the UK should not expect the countries it once colonised to be in agreement with it in all foreign policy decisions, nor to presume that they can be dragged into conflicts that do not directly involve them. When Imran Khan found himself in Moscow at the time of the invasion, he justified Pakistan's relationship with Russia by citing the need to look after the country's significant impoverished population. Though later, under the Pakistan Democratic Movement coalition government in 2023, Pakistan reportedly sold weapons that were then used by Ukraine to repel Russia. India has also imported far more discounted crude oil from Russia since its invasion of Ukraine and is its largest recipient of arms exports. Pakistan and India are also party to multilateral initiatives and organizations that are engaged in decolonial or related activities. Modern-day examples include the movement for climate justice, particularly through the concept of loss and damages, which seeks to create a fund for countries disproportionately affected by climate change, when nothing can be done to prevent the consequences of extreme weather events. Countries like the UK and US are expected to contribute funding because of their historic contribution to global emissions, which has resulted in climate change. Leaders of countries vulnerable to climate change have referred to such funds as reparations, but the only global North country to have done so was the Scottish Government in 2021, which became the first country to give such funding. But there is debate over whether India should benefit from such a fund because of its significant present-day contributions to global emissions. Pakistan and India are also members of the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. Despite the British government statement that reparations for slavery or related practices were not on the agenda at the 2024 meeting, the leaders' statement, which the meeting produced, stated that they, and I quote, agree that the time has come for a meaningful, truthful, and respectful conversation towards forging a common future based on equity with regards to this issue of reparative justice. End quote. Such multilateral initiatives thus have the power to force these important conversations in which the British are often unwilling to engage, but for which there is significant support among post-colonial and neo-colonial states. Next slide, please, Ishan. Scholars are increasingly referring to some formerly colonized nations as neo-colonial rather than post-colonial states, either because of the ongoing influence of foreign powers within the country or because of internal colonial forces. For example, I explored in my PhD how Zia-ul-Haq's regime in 1970s, 80s Pakistan presented the Islamization process as anti-colonial while it perpetuated colonial thought. I've already touched on how there have been expectations among the British that India would adopt this position.
Dr. Hunter, we lost you for a moment. Can you please repeat the last statement?
For example, yes, sorry, which cut off that? Should I just start from that slide again?
Yeah, this slide.
Yeah, yes, please. Yes, please.
Just the last few sentences.
Yeah.
States, either because of the ongoing influence of foreign powers within the country or because of internal colonial forces. For example, I explored in my PhD how Zia-ul-Haq's regime in 1970s and 80s Pakistan presented the Islamization process as anti-colonial while it perpetuated colonial thought and practice. I have already touched on how there has been some expectations among the British that countries like Pakistan and India would adopt the same position in foreign policy, often with regards to the former Soviet Union and contemporary Russia. For example, a member of the House of Lords expressed the hope in 1951 that Pakistan and India would be prepared to shoulder some of the efforts of the Western Bloc in the Cold War. It is also clear from the statements of the British politicians following partition that their support to Pakistan and India was not purely altruistic, but designed to further its own ideological aims. For example, it was argued that the provision of support to South Asian countries like Pakistan and India was not just about education and self-governance. Helping to put the countries in a position to feed themselves and be economically strong was also, and I quote, a part of the battle against communism, end quote, because this was perceived as the means by which the root appeal of communism might be tackled. The British government and related cultural organisations, such as the British Council, have also been engaged in promoting the English language and Western education in Pakistan and India since their independence. This has contributed to the colonial legacy of linguistic elitism, insofar as English has been maintained as a language of the laws and the Constitution, as well as an official language of administration and governance. English also remains a primary medium of education institutions in particular. The result is the marginalisation and lack of access for those who do not speak the English language. It has also been suggested that a part of the reason why the British government was slow to leave pre-partition India was because it was seeking to groom new Pakistani and Indian elites through whom they could ensure they could do business with to the benefit of the British. Next slide, please, Ishwan. My current research is focused on decolonisation in the UK-Pakistan cultural relationship, but I can summarise how decolonisation is unfolding within India too, which will have implications for its relationship with the UK. At the UN General Assembly in 2022, then Foreign Minister Jaishankar outlined 5 pledges that the BJP government sought to achieve in India by its centenary in 2047. One of these included liberation from a so-called colonial mindset. This liberation has at times been more symbolic, including the naming of islands after recipients of India's highest military award, the unveiling of a memorial for the Indian nationalist Subhas Chandra Bose, and the construction of a new Parliament House in New Delhi to replace the Colonial building. These reflect how Indians do not want to be defined by colonial symbols to which they cannot relate and which were enforced upon them in the first place. Decolonisation of the British colonial legacies also extends to education and language. While the National Education Policy of 2020 conspicuously did not mention the British or colonialism, it describes the policy's guiding light as, and I quote, the rich heritage of ancient and eternal Indian knowledge and thought, end quote. It also affirmed how education in ancient India was aimed at the liberation of the South, and that it produced world-class institutions and scholars which have had a lasting impact on the world. This reflects the important decolonial narrative that there has long been indigenous traditions and cultures within the region that do not owe their existence to the British colonial administration. The policy thus encourages the promotion of Indian arts and cultures to allow children to build their cultural identity, and also education into indigenous knowledge systems and traditional ways of learning. The same policy also expressed the commitment to creating bilingual textbooks and teaching materials so that students can think and communicate their education in both their mother tongue and in English. It encourages state institutions that give legal education to consider offering bilingual education for lawyers and judges, including in the language of the state. Modi himself also does not tend to speak in English at international forums. If you could move to the next slide, please, Ishan.
Sure.
But Jaishankar did not explicitly say that it was liberation from a British colonial mindset. And this is because the Modi-led BJP perceives India as having been subjected to colonialism and slavery for over 1,000 years, and therefore not just under the British. Indeed, this emphasis on ancient India within education works to bypass not only the British period of Indian history, but also the rule of the region by Muslim powers. Therefore, decolonisation under the BJP government has also come to mean the dismantling of the legacies of Muslim rulers too. There is a particularly good article on this that I've cited here. So it's not only the English place names that have been changed, but also those that are Muslim sounding. Not only the anti-British nationalists that are celebrated, but also the anti-Muslim ruler figures too. There was a particularly controversial moment in 2023 when a chapter on the Mughal rulers was not included in new textbooks released by the National Council of Educational Research and Training. This move was denounced both because it would remove a significant portion of history from children's education, but also because it is said to suit the nationalist right-wing's attempts to erase this part of the country's history. This division of history into neat and distinct periods of ancient Hindu, medieval Muslim, and modern British is believed to be both problematic and a legacy of the British colonial mindset. The anti-Muslim ruler aspect of decolonization in India has also exacerbated wider and pre-existing anti-Muslim and Islamophobic sentiment, portraying Indian Muslims as violent and as invaders as compared with India's indigenous Hindu population. This reflects a side to decolonization that we must be wary of, should it result in the cultivation of an exclusivist and a xenophobic identity that leads to real-life marginalization and discrimination. Next slide, please, Ishan. Unlike India, Pakistan has not explicitly committed itself to a process of decolonization, though as mentioned, it has been engaged in related areas, such as by making loss and damages an agenda item for the first time at any COP conference in 2022. A deal was also reached under its chairmanship of the G77. It was also party to the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting last year, and its statement that seeks to pursue reparative justice as an agenda item at the next meeting. However, there are some aspects of the single national curriculum first introduced in 2020 that might be construed as decolonial. For example, it includes a strand on Islamic history, which covers the response of Muslims to Western colonialism and Muslim contributions to scholarship and human rights. It also includes a section on Indo-Pakistan history in terms of the effects of British colonialism and the independence movement against it. But this lack of an official policy, as compared with India in particular, is partly why I chose to research decolonization in the UK-Pakistan cultural relationship, to recommend ways that the British can proactively engage in supporting decolonization in order to tackle ongoing injustices as a result of colonial legacies. It seems to me that the British government is increasingly falling behind international discourse on such matters. But what is both positive and exciting is the growing decolonization movement within Pakistani academia, occurring within different disciplines. This work has been particularly important for my own research. I'm afraid I won't go into detail now on my findings, as I hope to be publishing them in a policy memo by the end of my fellowship next month. If you could move to the next slide, please, Ishan. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. I hope that it was useful, and I welcome any comments or questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hunter, for a wonderful presentation. We will now be welcoming questions. There are two ways. You can post a question in the chat box where Dr. Hunter can read it and answer, or you can raise your hand from the taskbar above the screen. You can raise your hand and I will request one of you to ask the question about the questions, because we would like more questions to be answered and taken by Dr. Hunter. I would request not to get into a debate if something you feel is not totally, completely answered. You may put up a subsequent question, but please do not get into a debate. Zishan, you may go ahead with the first question, please.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Mary. It was really insightful, especially about understanding what actually decolonization is. My question is like, the decolonization movements in Pakistan and India. For example, in Pakistan, these are majorly run by, the Islamist movements, which are also quite some extent like extremist in nature. I mean, for example, Maulana Maududi in Pakistan, Jamaat Islami, they also claim like what they are doing, that's also decolonization, and they want to get rid of colonial legacies. On India side, what is happening, that's also the extremist kind of, the Hindu movements, which are like not only they are going for decolonization. They are also going for de-Islamization. According to them, there is not much difference between means British colonial legacies and means middle Central Asians like colonial legacies. They don't differentiate much. So what's your opinion about it? Do you think there is like the progressive movements related to the human rights and liberalism and all these things, and which are like for the decolonization, and which has the balanced approach in that regard?
Thank you so much for your question. Interestingly, part of my PhD was looking at how Maududi had a theological influence on Zir's Islamization process. So I talked about how they had a similar anti-colonial rationale for Islamization in Pakistan. So it is a good point that some people did within the Islamist movement were going towards a decolonial kind of approach to things, even as far back as at the time of independence and thereafter. It's a difficult one because, as you say, I think the case in India goes to show some of the dangers of decolonization if it's used to kind of marginalize and discriminate against people based on kind of stereotypes about the population. For me, decolonization is about removing injustices that have been established through colonialism. So I think then it becomes a problem when it's enforced upon the people in a similarly unjust way, and it has this approach to an identity that's quite exclusivist. People would say, scholars have said that in Pakistan and India, this tendency to put history into neat, distinct categories, like, as mentioned, ancient Hindu being more indigenous, and then medieval Muslim, and then modern British. They see that as quite artificial, and that it ignores actually the relationship between religions and cultures that existed in each of those periods. And we've seen also in Pakistan, both, I think, because of the British, but also because of Pakistani leaders, this attempt to kind of get rid of syncretic practices in the region that people would consider to be indigenous. So these would be ways in which, say, within Islam or say within Hinduism, there were aspects of faith that had been impacted by other religious communities or kind of cultural practices in the region. And people would say that actually that's an indigenous thing. So I think, yeah, we have to be careful about being exclusionary, and we have to reflect on actually what is kind of indigenous to the region. And often for me, in my understanding, is it's these more positive syncretic ways that bring people together regardless of their religious identity. So I think as long as decolonization isn't enforced in a similar way to, say, Islamization of Pakistan that was kind of enforced from the top down, and it doesn't use these kind of colonial artificial categories that differentiate between people, then I think it can be hopefully a force for good. But I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Hunter. Mr. Ismail, I do not get your complete name, but you may ask the question, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mary Hunter, for excellent presentation. My name is Ismail Said. I'm based in London. I'm a research fellow for Muslim Institute, and I'm a columnist for Bangladesh's daily, major English daily, Dhaka Tribune, for London Bureau. Yeah, great presentation. It's a hybrid question, and you can say a statement as well. Two things when it comes to decolonization. So first of all, from the perspectives, you can say from the Indian subcontinent, from the Muslim perspective, and you can include Bangladeshis and Pakistan, and to some extent Indians as well, is that the Muslim rule before the British, say the Mughals, they're not necessarily seen as colonizers, even though in some aspect it may be interpreted, which is totally understandable, but they are seen as more of a integrated and assimilated with the local community, with the concentration of the political power and the capital, as well as employing and giving political agencies to the local people. So in a way, they they shifted the metro. There wasn't a separate metropole where they came from. Unlike the British, the metropole was UK. And there was a kind of segregation or the political power. So it was mostly, the English or Anglo dominant in the key positions of power, right through, and that trickled down through to the culture. So that's one thing. Second thing is, second part is, so say in early 1900s or 1920s, the Australia, Canada, and South Africa, they managed to get the Dominion status. What stopped? There is a debate, but obviously I want to hear from you. What stopped the Indian Pakistan, or say undivided India, to get the full Dominion status? Even the Dominion status is not fully decolonized, but that's a separate issue. And third part, a common question which is raised by the Indian colleagues, is that the Pakistan, and you can include Bangladesh as well, to an extent, they are more enthusiastic when it comes to decolonization compared to the Indians. Yes, there were Maududis and Islamics, the Islamic movements, which were a byproduct or as a resistance to colonial imposition. So therefore, many say that had the British did not arrive to India, India will continue to be ruled as, say, the Muslim Mogul, or it could have been converted to a local Muslim hybrid Hindu republic, and it will be more secular. But because the colonialism arrived, just like in Egypt in 18th and 19th century, the effect of Napoleon and the British, that you had the Rashid Rada and other Muslim movements in Egypt. So you had the rise of Muslim imposition reaction. So that's why the Pakistan is a bit more slow to decolonization, as remarked by some Indian contemporaries, not all. So that's one thing. And also within that, they make a passive remark that the Muslim League, who asked for, or who really, they were more enthusiastic, the Muslim League, pre-divided India, of gaining and securing a partition as opposed to independence, while Indian Congress, they're more enthusiastic or more concentrated in securing independence as a whole from the British, while the Muslim Leagues were more concerned about not getting full independence from Britain, but more of getting some kind of partition. So these are the three things, three remarks I would like to make. And the last, just a couple of seconds, one Pakistani minister just recently discussed, and it comes to decolonization of education. So that's a separate, and it was started from the Imran Khan's short-lived era. And obviously I would not like to name him, and he's part of my interview as a columnist. And he said that the Pakistan, they want to go through decolonization, so therefore they started to introduce VAT or the thinking of some kind of tax introduction for students in Pakistan studying abroad or trying to take degrees from abroad. So they said that they want to impose a levy or a tax on all arts and humanities, so in order to deter students from going abroad to studying arts and humanities as part of the decolonization process, because when they come back, they come with a colonial mindset. That's their perspective. Save for the exceptions of science and the STEM subjects, that's a different issue. So I'll end it here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think we've been in touch on LinkedIn for a while, so it's good to finally interact with you. So with your first point in terms of the slightly different approach of Muslim rulers in the region, this is something that I want to look into more in the future. So I'm hoping, fingers crossed, I've applied to some postdoctoral positions. I'd like to do some research into like an indigenous Islamic liberation theology as an alternative to Zir's Islamization process. And for me, that's going to include quite a lot of historical reading into the way in which the Mughal and other Muslim rulers kind of behaved in the region. So that's an area that I'd like to look into, but I think it's interesting the points that you raised, especially in terms of the relationship between the metropole and the wider region. Why Dominion status was delayed? My understanding is that the British, if you look at what the politicians would say repeatedly, is the reason why they continued there was because India was one of the best things that they had in terms of like economic incentives to be there. The reason why they were in India was because of its benefit that it had financially from exploiting the resources in the region. So I think that was a major motivation. And then also, of course, with the world wars, it then also became a matter of defense, I think, as well. Defending its empire and dominions elsewhere. So I think those are two relevant factors. But I think also we have to bear in mind that there was a lot of infighting amongst the Indian nationalists themselves between, say, the Muslim League and the Congress and other movements as well. So I think when I read some of the books detailing the negotiations, it is quite enraging in some ways, the ways that people couldn't agree on things. And I think that certainly delayed probably the achievement of independence in some ways, because they couldn't agree on what it would be post-British. So I think that's a factor as well.
If I may interrupt, apologies. Could it be also the reason that Australia and Canada and South Africa, they seem to be more, from the colonial perspective, more civilized and ready to secure independence as opposed to Indian subcontinent? Is it like partially racism played a role?
I mean, I'm sure. I think my understanding is that actually I do believe that racism was very much, a part of the so-called civilizing mission in the region. And I think that continued until independence and even after independence. So that's probably a factor there, of course. But I do believe that then some of the, at least individuals involved in partition from the British side did actually care about the Indian population. There were perhaps not that many of them, but some of them were, I think, did care. So I think it was probably underlying, but I wouldn't want to say a sweeping generalization that all of them had that view. Why Pakistan's been slower to decolonize? I think part of it is economic, I guess. Pakistan, economically speaking, struggles as compared with India, and I think it's perhaps that strength of having maybe greater economic freedom and thus independence from powers like the British, that it's able to engage in decolonization to a greater extent. I think also, as mentioned, decolonization has to be something that's desired by the government itself. And obviously we've seen that to some degree, as you mentioned, under perhaps Imran Khan, but maybe to lesser extent under other governments. Whereas obviously in terms of the BJP government, it's very clearly a part of the wider narrative as a country that decolonization is so important, both against dismantling the British legacy, but also the Muslim legacy as well. But at the same time, my experience here is that there is a very big now decolonization movement within academia, and it's increasingly so, especially within the social sciences. And I'm looking forward to kind of seeing what that produces. But yes, it is an interesting point of comparison, I'd say, between Pakistan and India as to why one has been quicker to decolonize than the other. In terms of what you mentioned about Imran Khan and the tax, I hadn't heard about that before, but it's something that I will look into a bit more. Mainly, my research is focused on what the British can do, because obviously I'm conscious that how problematic it is being a white person from the UK talking about decolonization while sitting in Pakistan. So I'm more interested in the things that I can do, or that other British people can do as allies of decolonization to help that process. Ultimately, I'm not someone who can decide what decolonization within Pakistan internally should look like. What knowledge production should be enacted, which languages to prioritize, so on and so forth. So for me, it's looking more into the things that we can do as Brits in order to help the decolonization process. But thank you for your questions. They were insightful.
Thank you, Dr. Hunter. Naeem Virt is asking if there is any specific centers or city in Pakistan that is engaged actively in decolonization, especially academics.
Yeah, so I am kind of compiling a list of that at the moment. There was quite a big conference at the Air University in Islamabad last year, which was looking at producing South Asian epistemes with regards to international relations and strategic studies. And that's produced more scholarship on the concept. So that's a big one. There's also Quaid-e-Azam University at the School of Politics and International Relations. Two of their academics, Mohammed Nadeem Mirza and Farhan Siddiqui, have produced a book on international relations, which tries to show it from the perspective of Pakistan for the benefit of the students, so that they can relate to more of the examples and the approaches to international relations. So that's another centre of it. The University of Lahore are also doing a lot of work now on decolonisation in the context of climate change, and also, interestingly, nuclear studies. So obviously that's an area that often dominates academics on Pakistan. Interestingly, it was the first time I'd come across the term the indigenous kind of missiles and stuff, so that was interesting. So that's another area. And probably my favourite scholar working on decolonisation is Ahmed Waqas Wahid, and he's based at NUST in Islamabad. And he is the executive director of an organisation called the Rhodes Initiative, and they do a winter school every year for Pakistani students, which I did with them this year, that introduces them to alternative approaches to social sciences. And he's written a book on the way in which in international relations Pakistan is perceived. You know, there's often talk of a failed state or a garrison state and all this sort of language, and he questions, you know, on what basis they're making these kind of sweeping statements. And he looks into detail about how knowledge about Pakistan, how it's created, where it's created, and for what audience. So he's doing a lot of important work on decolonisation in international relations specifically. I'm hoping next month that we're going to be launching my policy memo, and we're hopefully going to do a conversation about that, and we'd invite people working on decolonisation in Pakistan to join in with that. So if any of you are interested or know anyone who would be interested, then do please let me know. I'm going to put my email in the meeting chat. But yeah, thank you.
Thanks a lot. Professor Shafiq wants to know if the concept of decolonization is not an attempt to turn the wheel of time back. Sometimes it seems that the concept of decolonization is connected closely with the return of other imperialism, with the hegemony of alternate powers, sometime in the form of majoritarian dictatorship in democracy. What do you think? We seem to have lost Dr. Mary. Can you please begin the answer again? We lost you for a moment, please.
No worries. Yeah, I was just reading the question again. So I can put in a link to my thesis in the chat as well. So as mentioned, I was looking at Zia-ul-Haq specifically. Islamization of Pakistan. I think that's a good example of some. So I was just saying specifically in the context of India, that so it's claiming to be engaged in the decolonization process, but if you look at the way it treats, say, journalists or political opposition, it can sometimes use this concept of the colonial mindset to deflect from legitimate criticism. So a good example was how the BBC produced that documentary on the Gujarat situation in 2002, in which Modi was said to be complicit in these communal riots. And the government then used the name of it's just the British and the colonial mindset that, has kind of led to these allegations. So that's a good example of how it can be used to deflect. And I'd say the way in which Modi's government has stifled freedom of speech and also criticism, legitimate criticism from activists and journalists, particularly in the context of Jammu and Kashmir, how he's used colonial era laws in order to repress opposition to his government, is also a good example of the misuse of this name of decolonization. And I compare in an article what Zia did and what we've done over the last kind of 10 years. So it's a really good point, and this is why I think it has to be a really careful process, and why scholars working on decolonization have to be clear to set the parameters of decolonization from the beginning. But ultimately, as I say, I think it is meant to be about fighting injustice. So as long as we're conscious of when it's actually decolonization and when it's just being used for some ulterior motives. But that's a really good question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sumaira Akram says that there's a debate that Islamism and Islamism-inspired non-state groups invited Islam in the public sphere to harness their political anti-colonial narratives through violence and militancy and terrorism. Since Pakistan is 96% Muslim majority and Islamist-inspired terrorist groups infiltrated Pakistani society on a larger scale, and at the same time, the Pakistani nationalism project is conflated with religious nationalism. So how do you see decolonization project making a lot of academic transformation through introducing decolonial legal frameworks and education policies, when at the same time Pakistani state and power nexus originates from the colonial age sown seeds?
Yeah, this is a really good question, and I think very multifaceted and a complicated one. So as mentioned, obviously, me being a foreigner, I can work on certain aspects of decolonization, and there are others that I can't. And I think at the end of the day, as you say, decolonization has to be desired by the people and by the government. I think you're right to mention the anti-colonial nature of certain violent groups. I would probably resist calling them Islamist groups, because I think that Islam and terrorism are inherently polar opposites, really. Islam doesn't justify terrorism. But yeah, if you look at groups, say like the TLP, and especially the way in which they're anti-colonial, especially towards the French, but the Americans as well, and how that's kind of linked to their kind of violent agendas, particularly in the context of the so-called blasphemy laws, and how they respond to certain situations, especially in France with Charlie Hebdo, between anti-colonialism and violence, and of course with the case of America as well, anti-imperialism in the wake of the war on terror, because of the disproportionate effect of that conflict on especially the northern regions of Pakistan. So I can see how there is this difficult side of it too, with the link between anti-colonial groups and violence. But trying to answer your question, yeah, this is why it's tricky, because ultimately it has to be desired by the people who are in power in order to make it a reality. And of course, if you look at the scholarship of the decolonial scholarship in Pakistan today, a lot of that is equally looking at Pakistan's internal situation as much as it is looking at the way in which British colonialism or American neocolonialism has affected Pakistan. So for them, it's as much about the power nexus within Pakistan as it is about the British colonial and American colonial legacies in the area. So yeah, I would just say it has to be something that the government and the people desire, and whether or not that will happen, we'll have to kind of wait and see. But sorry, your question was very complicated and multifaceted, so I hope that was all right.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hunter, you for answering the questions and for sharing your email. I would now request, we are coming towards the end of the session. I would now request Ambassador Khayyam Akbar to kindly,
Umar, can I request Ismail Saab to switch off video? Because it's for only recording purpose. Otherwise, he would be in the video only. Okay, thank you, Ismail Saab. Yeah.
We have another question by Dr. Ismail, but I'm sure he can post it, send it through email. So I would request Ambassador Khayyam Akbar to kindly conclude the session.
Thank you very much, Umar, and thank you, Dr. Mary Hunter. So kind of you to share your some moments with us, with the members of PRISA, as well as the extended participants which we witness here today. It was a very well researched and a very comprehensive presentation which you made here today, and particularly for a layman like me, it was really interesting to learn more about the historical background of both colonization as well as decolonization, as well as the evolution of decolonization, which we have seen since 1947, wherein some changes has taken place both by the India and Pakistan, and also the legacies which still stand on the part of the British colonial masters of the past. But it was a very wonderful presentation, and I am sure we all would wait for the findings which you are compiling for your fellowship, if I understand correctly, and that I'm sure that would help contribute more towards the area of decolonization, and for both academically as well as for persons like me, and also for the governments of both India and Pakistan, in the forms of recommendations how to continue a process which would not only at one end might decolonize, but at the other end would create linkages with the past, which was, although colonial past, but it had many positives for all of us in the South Asian region. I understand one point which you mentioned one or two times, and I think that is a very significant one, and that was that the decolonization process is basically something where the injustices of colonizations are to be removed. I think that is a very significant element, and which should be pursued by both the countries which we are talking about today. I'm thankful again on behalf of PRISA, would like to thank you for your kind time which you shared with us, as well as enlightening us in a very positive manner. And so I wish you best of luck for your future endeavors, and we hope we will continue to learn more and more from you on the particular area of your research. Thanks a lot.
Bahut shukriya, Ambassador Saab.
Thank you so kind.
Thank you very much, Khayyam Sahab. And I would like to end the session by formally thanking Dr. Mary Hunter and all the participants, because there was an eagerness and enthusiasm to put questions, and I'm sure some questions would still have remained unanswered. You have Dr. Hunter's email address where you can post the questions. Thank you on behalf of PRISA. I thank Dr. Mary Hunter for her precious, generous time and effort that she spared for enlightening us. Thanks a lot. We call it a day now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.